fate or some mysterious force can put the finger on you or me for no good reason at all. That's a line from one of my favorite noirs, Detour.
Oh, yeah.
Bleak, beautiful, and boy, does it ever capture that classic film noir mood.
Really does.
And guess what? We get to dive deep into that world today.
Oh, fun.
Yeah. We've got a stack of really interesting sources for this one. Academic papers on everything from noir themes to the evolution of the femme fatale, articles from a film magazine that's dedicated to all things noir.
Oh, wow.
And even a student's take on how a classic Western Ramrod plays with some of those classic noir tropes.
Interesting.
Now, before we start talking about specific films and unpacking the student's argument, let's make sure we're all on the same page.
Okay.
When we say film noir, what are we actually talking about?
Well, you have to remember, it's more than just a genre.
Okay.
Film noir represents a very specific period in American cinema, those Hollywood films made in the 1940s and early 1950s. It wasn't just what they were showing, it was when. These films weren't just reflecting a genre, they were reflecting a cultural moment.
So instead of just cowboys and aliens, we're talking gangsters and femme fatale.
Right.
What about that post-war world made those stories resonate with audiences?
Think about it. You have returning soldiers grappling with disillusionment, a post-war economy that left a lot of people on edge, and those shifting gender roles as women who had been working during the war were suddenly expected to go back to being housewives.
Right.
It's like the whole country was experiencing this collective hangover after the war, and film noir was the cinematic equivalent of that feeling.
Now that you mention it, those themes really do jump out at you, even if you aren't looking for them. So those historical anxieties seeped into everything from the characters to the stories themselves.
Absolutely. You see it most clearly in those iconic film noir characters. Those hard-boiled detectives with a cynical edge.
Right.
The femme fatales with their smoky eyes and questionable motives. And those anti-heroes who are just as flawed as the villains they're up against. These weren't just stock characters.
Right.
They were reflecting the anxieties of that era.
And none are more debated, even today, than the femme fatale.
Right.
One of our sources, a paper by Julie Grossman, even argues that we need to see some of these femme fatales as hard-boiled females. What's the difference?
Exactly. Well, the traditional view of the femme fatale is that she's a temptress, a manipulator who uses her sexuality to get what she wants.
Right.
And often leads men to their downfall. But Grossman argues that this simplifies things. Some femme fatales, she says, are actually hard-boiled females. Women who are pushing back against the societal constraints of their time.
So not just using their sexuality, but their intelligence, their ambition,
yes,
even their ruthlessness to try and carve out a space for themselves.
Exactly. And that's a really important distinction to make because it goes beyond the surface level.
Yeah.
And forces us to ask deeper questions about these characters and their motivations. Are they villains or are they victims of a system that gives them very few options?
Which makes you think, does that explain why the femme fatale still fascinates us even today? Is it because those power dynamics, those anxieties about female agency haven't really gone away?
It's definitely worth thinking about. And it's a great example of how film noir can still spark these really relevant conversations about gender, power, and societal expectations, even decades later.
Speaking of sparking conversations, one of our sources for this deep dive is a student paper that makes a really interesting argument about a Western called Ramrod.
Okay.
Now, how does a Western even enter the picture when we're talking about film noir?
It's fascinating, actually.
Okay.
The student points out that Ramrod, which was released in 1947, subverts some of those typical expectations for women in film during that era, especially when you compare it to those classic film noir tropes.
And Ramrod does this through the main female character, Connie Dickinson, right? This tough rancher who's not afraid to fight for what she wants.
Precisely. The student draws a parallel between Connie and characters like Mildred Pierce or even Judge Margaret Turner. They all represent ambitious women who push back against societal expectations. But what's fascinating is that Ramrod seems to offer a more optimistic view of a woman who embraces her power and ambition.
Oh, okay. So you've got me hooked. I need to see this Ramrod movie now and decide for myself if it really stacks up against a classic film noir. But before we get totally sidetracked by rogue westerns, let's talk about those signature film noir visuals.
Ah, yes. The visuals are impossible to ignore, and they play such a crucial role in creating that atmosphere of suspense, moral ambiguity, and frankly, that stylish coolness that we associate with film noir.
It's more than just fedoras and trench coats, right? It's about the way those things are lit, the way the camera moves. Almost like the world itself is a character in these films.
You hit the nail on the head. One of our sources actually describes the visual style of film noir as a style forged in darkness.
Oh.
It's all about low-key lighting, where faces are often partially obscured by shadows, creating a sense of mystery and unease.
Yes.
And let's not forget those rain-slick streets reflecting the neon signs and giving the city this dreamlike yet menacing quality.
And it's not just the lighting, it's the camera angles, too. All those Dutch angles and those shots looking down on the characters like they're trapped in a world that's closing in on them.
Absolutely. Those oblique angles are incredibly important because they disrupt the visual plane. It's a subtle way of visually representing a world that's literally and figuratively out of balance, mirroring the moral ambiguity and uncertainty that these characters are grappling with.
It's like the camera work itself is a reflection of their inner turmoil. Speaking of inner turmoil, one thing I've always found fascinating about film noir is that it doesn't shy away from exploring those darker, more morally ambiguous aspects of human nature.
Right. And that's something else that sets this period apart. It's not just about good guys and bad guys.
Right.
It's about those gray areas in between. The lines are blurred.
Yeah.
You have protagonists who are flawed, who make questionable choices, and who often operate outside the law.
Right.
And then you have antagonists who are sometimes driven by understandable, even relatable motives.
It makes you wonder.
It makes you wonder if those shades of gray are what keep us coming back to these stories.
Yeah.
It's that uncertainty, the questioning of right and wrong, that make these films so psychologically gripping.
It's true. Those clear-cut heroes and villains you see in other genres just wouldn't work in a film noir.
No.
You need that moral ambiguity to really sell the atmosphere.
You do.
But speaking of things that set film noir apart, one of our sources argues that these films reflect a really interesting shift in societal thinking when it comes to religion.
That's right. It's true.
Yeah.
One of the articles we have here, The Mercifully Godless Universe of Film Noir, dives right into that.
Okay.
The author argues that unlike earlier films that often relied on traditional religious frameworks, film noir presents a much more fatalistic, even existentialist worldview.
So instead of looking to a higher power for answers, these characters are just kind of adrift in a universe where they have to face the consequences of their actions with no guarantee of redemption.
Exactly. And that lack of a moral safety net just adds to that feeling of paranoia and unease that we were talking about earlier.
Right.
It's like they're stuck in this world where fate has the upper hand and they're just pawns in some cosmic game they don't even understand.
No wonder those characters always look so world-weary.
Right.
You'd be sipping whiskey and staring out windows, too, if you constantly felt like you were at the mercy of fate.
Totally.
But, you know, it's funny. We keep talking about film noir as this fixed thing.
Yeah.
But one of our sources, Paul Schrader, actually argues that there were distinct phases within this period.
Right.
Did those anxieties we've been talking about evolve over time, too?
They definitely did.
Yeah.
Schrader identifies 3 key phases in his essay.
Okay.
The first, during the war years, had a more romantic, almost stylized feel.
Okay.
You had a lot of private detectives, those atmospheric settings, and the stories often revolved around things like amnesiacs or mistaken identities.
So more about personal mysteries, less about societal ones.
Exactly.
Okay.
Then as you move into the post-war period, you see this shift towards realism.
Okay.
The films get grittier, the focus shifts towards street crime and corruption, and those social anxieties we've been talking about really come to the forefront.
The country's hangover is getting worse.
Right. And by the late 40s, early 50s, film noir takes a turn towards even darker territory.
Oh, no.
You start to see this rise in what Schrader calls psychotic action and suicidal impulses.
Yeah.
Those noir heroes, those tough guys we talked about earlier,
Yeah.
they start to crack under the pressure.
It's almost like the genre itself is mirroring the trajectory of post-war America, right? You have that initial optimism, then the disillusionment sets in, and finally there's the sense of, well, impending doom.
Absolutely. And you have to remember, this is also the beginning of the Cold War, a time when anxieties about nuclear annihilation were very real.
Right.
Film noir, with its dark visuals, its cynical worldview, and its exploration of those darker aspects of human nature, becomes a way of processing those anxieties, of giving them a tangible form on screen.
Which makes you wonder, if film noir had continued beyond the 1950s, how would it have reflected the cultural shifts of the 60s, the 70s, even today? What would a film noir about the digital age look like with all our modern anxieties about technology and social media?
Now, that's an interesting question. And it's one that filmmakers are still grappling with today.
Right.
We see it in those neo-noir films that borrow elements from those classic films while updating them for a modern audience.
It's like those shadows from the past are finding new ways to creep into our present. Speaking of shadows from the past, one of our sources mentions this film festival called Noir City,
Yes.
which is dedicated entirely to preserving and celebrating film noir.
Yes. Noir City is a fantastic festival that screens classic noirs,
Oh, cool.
hosts discussions with film historians and critics, and even has a Ms. Noir City contest.
Fun.
It's a real testament to the enduring legacy of these films and the passionate community of fans they continue to inspire.
It's amazing to think that these films, made decades ago, still have the power to bring people together, to spark those conversations about art, society, and those timeless questions about good and evil, fate and free will.
It really speaks to the enduring power of good storytelling and those universal themes that continue to resonate with us, no matter how much time has passed.
Yeah.
And that's something that film noir does so brilliantly.
Right.
It reminds us that even in the darkest of times, even when we feel lost and uncertain, even when those shadows seem to be closing in,
Yeah.
there's always a story to be told, a connection to be made, and a light to be found.
You know, for as much as we talk about the darkness and cynicism of film noir, that's a really beautiful thought. But I think you're right. There's a kind of twisted optimism at the heart of these films. Because no matter how bleak things get, the story always goes on. And speaking of stories going on, I can't believe we haven't talked more about, wrong number yet.
Right.
I mean, talk about a masterclass in suspense and psychological tension.
Absolutely. And what's so fascinating about that film is that it really taps into those anxieties about vulnerability and isolation that were so prevalent in post-war America.
Right.
You have Barbara Stanwyck at her absolute best playing this bedridden woman who overhears a phone conversation that suggests a murder is about to take place.
And she's completely trapped, confined to her bed, relying on that phone as her only lifeline to the outside world.
Yes.
You can't help but feel that sense of claustrophobia and dread building as the story unfolds.
Exactly. And one of our sources, Megan Abbott, points out that the director, Anatole Litvak, uses that extended phone conversation scene to essentially transform the viewer into the protagonist.
Oh, wow.
We're not just watching Leona Stevenson's story unfold.
Right.
We're experiencing it right alongside her.
It's like those cinematic techniques, the way the camera focuses on the phone, the sound design, the way those fragmented conversations are edited together.
Yes.
It all works to put us right there in that room with her, feeling her fear, her desperation, her groaning certainty that something terrible is about to happen.
And it's brilliant because it forces us to confront our own vulnerability, our own fears about being isolated and helpless.
It makes you wonder, are those anxieties still relevant today? In our hyper-connected world, are we even capable of feeling that same sense of isolation that permeates so many film noirs?
It's a question worth pondering, especially when you consider how technology, for all its benefits, can also lead to a different kind of isolation.
That's true.
But before we spiral down that rabbit hole, we should definitely talk more about Detour, because talk about a film that takes fatalism to a whole new level.
You know, you're right. There's this sense of inevitable doom hanging over Detour that's just inescapable. You almost get the feeling that Al Roberts is doomed from the very first frame, and he's just along for this wild, tragic ride.
And it's not just Al, right? Vera, often considered one of the most iconic femme fatales in cinema history, is also trapped by circumstance. One of our sources even argues that her actions, however destructive, are ultimately a reflection of that entrapment.
Okay, I'm game. How can you see Detour as anything but a classic femme fatale story? I mean, she's the one who sets the whole chain of events in motion.
Think about it. She's a woman who's trying to make her way in a world that offers her very few options.
Okay.
Her choices might be morally questionable, but they're driven by a desire for survival, for agency, in a system that constantly tries to keep her down. It's that classic noir blend of victimhood and villainy that makes these characters so compelling.
You know what? You've got a point. It's easy to get caught up in the classic tropes, but when you look closer, you realize that Detour and film noir in general is so much more nuanced than that.
Exactly. And one of the things that makes Detour so effective at conveying that nuance is its brilliant use of visual metaphors, especially when it comes to themes of fate and entrapment.
Oh, tell me more about this. I'm a sucker for a good visual metaphor.
Well, one of the most striking things about Detour is how often you see those long, winding roads stretching endlessly into the distance. It's like a
Yeah.
visual representation of Al's journey, but also of his inability to escape his destiny. No matter how much he tries to outrun his past, those roads just keep leading him further down a path he can't control.
Wow, that's a great catch. It's amazing how those seemingly simple cinematic choices can add so much depth to a film, which I guess brings us back to Ramrod and that student's argument about how it plays with those classic film noir tropes. They were arguing that the film's ending is both empowering and ambiguous for Connie, right?
Exactly. She achieves her goal, she gets the ranch, she wins the range war, but she's left alone.
Oh.
Her old flame rides off into the sunset, literally, with a woman who represents a simpler, more traditional life. And the student argues that this ending doesn't offer any easy answers. It's left to the viewer to decide. Was this a victory for Connie or a hollow triumph?
Man, now I really need to see Ramrod. It sounds like it's engaging with these really complex questions about ambition, gender roles, and what it means to be a woman in a man's world, even if it is disguised as a Western.
And that's what's so exciting about film noir. Those themes, those anxieties, they're not confined to a single genre. They find their way into Westerns, into crime dramas, even into romantic comedies.
Those shadows have a way of sneaking into everything, don't they? It makes you think, as we're wrapping up this deep dive, that maybe those shadows are part of what make these stories so compelling. Because life itself is full of shadows, full of those gray areas, those moral ambiguities, those moments where we have to confront the darkness within ourselves and the world around us.
Absolutely. And maybe that's why film noir continues to resonate with us, even decades later. It holds up a mirror to those shadows, those anxieties, those uncomfortable truths about ourselves and the society we live in.
It's like those filmmakers back in the 40s and 50s tapped into something timeless, something essential about the human experience. Because those questions about good and evil, fate and free will, love and betrayal, those never really go away, do they?
They don't. And thankfully, neither does film noir.
Well said. And on that note, we'll wrap things up for this deep dive into the world of film noir. We hope you've enjoyed exploring those dark alleys and shadowy streets with us. And who knows, maybe this deep dive has inspired you to revisit those classic films or seek out some new favorites. Because like those flickering shadows on a chiaroscuro lit wall, film noir is a genre that stays with you long after the credits have rolled.
Take a deep dive in the sound. Feel the echoes all around. Voices whisper in your ears. Unlock the stories, have no fears. Let's escape into the stream. Ride the waves within the theme. Open minds and let it thrive. Join us in this deep dive. Get on your swim fins, film fans. We're not sliding down the main street. You're about to take a deep dive, if you know what I mean. So grab your headphones, let it flow. Explore the topics, watch them grow. Join the journey, feel the vibe. Together we're taking this deep dive.
The Deep Dive Film Talk podcast is wholly generated by artificial intelligence. All of the research materials gathered were taken from the archives of another podcast and used wholly with permission. Copyright 2024 Weirding Way Media.